I'm Bill Kassel, and this is Free Expression. This program is all about conveying the Christian message from a Catholic point of view and defending the liberty which makes it possible to do that. We examine Catholic figures defending human rights in history and today, and we discuss movies that highlight the liturgical year. Join us, sit back, and enjoy some free expression. Censorship and media distortion are facts of modern American life. We're all pretty much accustomed to news reports and even entertainment programming that try to guide our thinking about various issues. A major influence on our media is China. Companies linked to the Chinese Communist Party have invested heavily in Western outlets. How often do you see shows about Chinese spies stealing U.S. technology secrets? Russians are the usual bad guys, not normally the Chinese, and that's no coincidence. Well, if it's tough for American media to avoid Chinese pressure, imagine trying to run an independent news operation inside China itself. That was the challenge faced by Jimmy Lai, a Hong Kong businessman who became a media mogul and who now sits in a Chinese prison. The Acton Institute, a free market think tank based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, has produced a documentary about the life and struggles of Jimmy Lai. Steve Barrows is the producer, and he's here now. Steve, thanks for taking a few minutes to tell us about this important film.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Bill.
The success of Jimmy Lai's media operation was once seen as a hopeful sign for increased openness in China. That's certainly changed. Give us a little background on his situation, if you would.
Sure. Well, Jimmy Lai is, as you mentioned, he's from Hong Kong, originally from mainland China, and he fled Maoist revolutionaries when he was 12 years old and lived a life as a simple textile laborer in Hong Kong. And eventually his gifts and talents enabled him to become a successful entrepreneur. And so he did everything from building an enormously successful clothing retail business to eventually, as you noted, founding a successful newspaper called Apple Daily. And so Apple Daily was a pro-democracy, in fact, the only pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong, and it became wildly successful. And then, of course, as Hong Kong became controlled progressively by the Chinese Communist Party, they saw Apple Daily and Jimmy Lai specifically as a threat to their ruling power. So unfortunately, he has been in prison now for several years, and the Chinese Communist Party shut down Apple Daily, and it unfortunately published his last newspaper just a couple of summers ago.
Yeah, it was kind of amazing that he was able to operate for as long as he did.
That's right. You know, he has always been an ambitious individual to promote freedom, and he's also a very faith-filled man, and he knew the threat that information posed to those who want to impose an autocratic rule over people. And so his motivation was really triggered from the Tiananmen Square protests back in 1989, where the Chinese Communist Party really aggressively shut down and massacred some people for their protests for democratic reform in mainland China. And Jimmy knew that he needed to speak out, and that's really the impetus for founding Apple Daily.
I remember the TV coverage of the handing over of Hong Kong from the British to the Chinese, and they showed pictures of Chinese troops sitting at attention on buses, waiting for the moment to come when they would enter and establish Chinese control. That was a pretty chilling image at the time, and it certainly seems that the Chinese have moved steadily over the years to tighten things up and impose ever stricter controls.
Yes, that's right. You know, I remember it myself as well. That was back in summer of 1997,
right.
And it marked the end of a lease that the UK government had on Hong Kong, and that was the handover that they gave to mainland China, with the understanding that there would be significant autonomy given to Hong Kong for the next 50 years. so we ended up going through half of that period, and you could see during that first 25 years after the handover in 1997, as you note, the Chinese Communist Party progressively restricted the freedoms of Hong Kong much more than they ever agreed to. And now you can see that they've effectively eliminated the agreement that they had to allow them to have significant autonomy. You know, the phrase was one nation, two systems, you may recall, where you would continue to have a largely free economy in Hong Kong. But again, the mainland Chinese government has stepped back from their agreement.
I would have thought that it would be advantageous to the Chinese to let Hong Kong have a high measure of freedom, sort of being their gate to the larger world. Why did they step back from that?
So I think you're right. I would have thought the same thing because, after all, Hong Kong was highly successful, and there was much hope that Hong Kong would actually have an influence more on China than the reverse. I think that the big change occurred when Xi Jinping became the General Party Secretary and President back in 2012. Some of his predecessors seemed to be more open to reform within mainland China, but Xi has shown himself to be really following in the footsteps of Mao and exercising progressive control over that. I think there's all sorts of geopolitical reasons why he has chosen to rule with an iron fist, but certainly he had every incentive to suppress any democratic reforms because of a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's power.
Well, what is Jimmy Lai's status now? He's in jail. He's charged with sedition, I understand. What are the conditions under which he's being held? Does anybody know?
That's correct. So first, he has been in prison on and off since his initial arrest in August of 2020, and then he has not been released since I think it was early 2021. And there's been several charges that have been levied against him, and he's been convicted of everything from a ridiculous fraud charge with respect to a lease, and then he was prosecuted under the national security law for sedition and collaborating with individuals, particularly in the United States, to undermine China's authority. And so he has been over 3 years now, or actually approaching 2 years this December, when his conviction for a 5-year sentence was completed. He is now continuing a current trial under the national security law, and the Chinese government and the Hong Kong judiciary keeps pushing that trial out. Every time you think there's going to be a ruling, they push it out. And unfortunately, he's been in solitary confinement for much of that time. His conditions are not good from all accounts that we hear, but he has maintained significant hope and faith. And you can see that in whatever communications he's allowed to have, that he has maintained a stalwart faith, knowing that he's doing the right thing and he's standing up for human rights.
Well, how can people view this film, find out more about it? I assume there's a website.
Yes, so the Hong Konger movie, if you just Google that, the Hong Konger movie is the website, and you can actually view the movie free. It's on YouTube, and it's just a little over an hour movie, and it also has closed captions in different languages. And so anybody can feel free to go to the Hong Konger movie and link through. You also can find more on that website about things that you can do to promote his freedom. It's such an important trial and such an important voice for the people of Hong Kong. And to see that Hong Kong has lost so much of its freedom, that the world needs to know that this is a remaining voice for the cause of freedom and faith for the people of China as well.
Steve Barrows of the Acton Institute, The Hong Konger, the story of Jimmy Lai. Thanks very much for taking time to tell us about this. It sounds like, in its own right, an engaging film, but it carries a very, very important message for freedom throughout the world, I think.
Absolutely. Yes, my pleasure, Bill. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm old enough to remember the civil rights movement and I can recall usually spotting a few nuns and priests in the televised images of marches and sit-ins and other demonstrations. One of the under-acknowledged aspects of church history is how many Catholics have been involved in efforts to improve the lot of poor and oppressed people. Roxanne King is co-author of a book that seeks to correct that oversight. It's titled Catholic Heroes of Civil and Human Rights, and she's here to talk about it. Roxanne, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
The church hasn't always gotten credit in this area, has it?
No, it hasn't. It was very exciting for me even to learn about the beautiful efforts that individuals have made over the years that people just aren't aware of. I wasn't aware of many of their stories.
Yeah, now your book profiles 16 Catholics, both lay and religious. Who are some of the folks that you're looking at here?
I focused on the 6 African-American causes for canonization currently underway, but also people who, for example, a young couple who were very involved in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, involved with voter registration in the Deep South. The husband had marched in the entire Selma to Montgomery, Alabama march. And people like Nicholas Black Elk, a Native American who many people know of due to a book that was written about him, Black Elk Speaks. But the book only covers his life as a young boy and as a young adult, even though he was interviewed in his late 60s and left out the fact that Black Elk had been a Catholic catechist for more than 4 decades and brought many people to Christianity and brought hope and new life to his people who had been devastated through the Indian American Wars and being put on reservations. So this is a treasure of inspiring stories that many people just aren't aware of. So yes, Black Elk, Julia Greeley from Denver, who was a former slave who came to work for the first territorial governor of Colorado. I'm in Denver. She came to Denver about 1878, and even though she came to work as a domestic for the Gilpin family, they were Catholic. Mrs. Gilpin was Catholic and became Catholic. She converted at our local Sacred Heart Church, and even though she was desperately poor herself, had this beautiful mission to help the poor, and also had this beautiful mission of evangelization to firefighters who had very dangerous jobs. There had been a horrible fire at a fire station in Denver. All the men had died, and she would make this little pilgrimage once a month on First Fridays to the 20 different fire stations to hand out prayer leaflets so that they could be prepared for a holy death because their jobs were so dangerous. And when she died, hundreds of people turned out for her visitation, which was hours long at a little chapel, people from all walks of life. And her story of charity, she became known as Denver's Angel of Charity, became known really when the Denver Catholic Register, the Denver Post, the Rocky Mountain News all ran big obituaries letting people know about old Julia, who is much beloved. So yeah, people like this who maybe aren't very well known by the dioceses outside of which their causes have been begun, to let them be known by a wider audience.
The church has been in this game for a long time, but has it really been consistent in its understanding of human rights? I mean, I think back to a time when slavery and serfdom and such institutions were basic parts of everyday life. Has there been an evolution over the years?
The church has always been against slavery, but yes, unfortunately, Christians did participate in slavery as it became commonplace in the New World. But the church has always been against slavery and discrimination because the church teaches that we are all made in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, we all have dignity and are entitled to freedom. And the church teaches that the true freedom is the freedom to choose the good, to do the right thing. When we do that, naturally, we are truly free.
You deal with people like Pierre Toussaint. Is that how that name is pronounced?
Pierre Toussaint. So Pierre had been brought to New York City from Haiti, what is today Haiti, as a domestic, as a butler. And at that time, in the early 1800s, he worked as a hairdresser, which was a very big occupation, a lucrative occupation at that time, because women were very fancy hairstyles that needed a lot of attention. And his owners, actually the head of the house died, and Pierre, because he was like the number one hairdresser in New York City, old New York City, he took it upon himself to support the household because the family that owned him had really lost their money. He was also known for tremendous philanthropy. He purchased freedom for his sister. He purchased freedom for his beloved, who then he married. He and his wife took in black youths, saw to it that they were educated so that they could have a career. He helped to build what is now Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. He supported financially an orphanage run by Mother Seton. He supported the first black congregation for women. And he said that he never felt like he was a slave to any man or woman, but a servant of Almighty God who made everyone. And when one of his children is in need, he said, I am glad to be his slave. He's a beautiful example of true freedom.
The book is Catholic Heroes of Civil and Human Rights, 1800s to the Present, by Matthew Daniels and Roxanne King. It's from Ignatius Press, so where can people find out more about it?
You can visit www.catholicheroes.com, which will take you directly to the book at Ignatius Press's website. And you can read the wonderful, kind endorsements that it's received. Archbishop Chaput, Cardinal Stafford, Archbishop Gomez, Bishop Conley of Lincoln, Nebraska, George Weigel. So you can read the wonderful endorsements. You can read about the book. It's also available at Catholic bookstores, Amazon.
This is a fascinating thing to undertake. These are people who had tremendous impact in their time and whose impact has lasted, but they may not all be very well known. So this is an opportunity to shine a spotlight on some true Catholic heroes. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
When I was in school, seeing the movie projector set up was always a good sign. It meant an easy day in class. Well, it doesn't work quite that way in church. Watching a movie isn't a substitute for worship, but it can supplement our spiritual lives. Many fine motion pictures have been built around themes of faith and virtue and salvation, or the lives of great figures in Christian history. Abby Olcese is a writer on movies and other aspects of popular culture. She's produced a new book from InterVarsity Press, Films for All Seasons, Experiencing the Church Year at the Movies. Abby, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, take us through the liturgical calendar. What are some movies that can enrich our devotional year?
Well, there's a lot of movies in here, but I kind of start at the beginning of the church calendar with Advent and go all the way through All Saints and All Souls Day. I've tried to make the film selection in the book a little different than what you might expect, partly because I want to kind of encourage people to expand their horizons a little bit in understanding what movies with spiritual importance or spiritual value can be. but also to kind of change it up a little bit. Like, we're all familiar with our favorite classic Christmas movies, like It's a Wonderful Life, and that's a great movie as well, but there are so many other things that deserve our attention. So for Advent, one of the first movies that shows up in that chapter is the Star Wars movie, The Last Jedi, just because I feel like that movie has a lot of really relevant things to say about the concept of hope and what importance that concept plays in the Star Wars movies as a whole. I also talk about the Paddington movies, Paddington 1 and 2, as sources of joy, both because they're really fun movies to watch, but also because they are good examples of what it looks like to live a joyful life, not just during Advent, but the whole year around. And I kind of go through the rest of the church year. There's movies of all different genres. There's really something for everybody, whether you're an adult or a kid or just somebody who enjoys any kind of movie, no matter what area it's coming from.
Right. An interesting way of looking at it. These are not the conventionally Christian movies that we all expect. You know, we're all accustomed to seeing Ben-Hur or the Ten Commandments pulled out at Easter time, or more recently, maybe The Passion of the Christ. But you're taking a little more creative point of view here.
Yeah, and that's kind of by design. This book started as an article series for a website called Think Christian during the pandemic, actually, where my editor, Josh Larson, who's the co-host of the Film Spotting podcast and a great film writer in his own right, asked me to make recommendations for people to watch at home while churches were closed and they couldn't worship communally, because movies are just a great way to connect with other people, even if you're watching them separately. I know I had a lot of fun conversations with friends over Zoom while we watched movies together, but he wanted specifically to kind of focus on some more popular movies, basically, movies that people would recognize, but maybe not necessarily recognize as Holy Week or Christmas or Easter movies, but had kind of similar themes. And from there, I just kind of moved on and started seeing those themes in other movies that I really loved, some of which are not necessarily as wildly popular as some of the movies that appeared in that article series to begin with. And so when I realized I had the outline for a book, I thought it would be kind of fun to dig a little bit deeper and encourage people to check out movies that maybe they haven't heard of.
What makes a movie religious? Sometimes it's not explicitly so, and yet it carries... It can carry very strong spiritual messages. Sure.
For me, I tend to see everything in story, partly because I'm a film critic, and that's kind of the way my brain is wired. But I really connect to the literary themes in the Bible and how all of them kind of connect to each other and create together this really beautiful overarching story of God's people and God's grace toward his people who, as I'm sure you're aware, frequently mess up. And so I find that, A, really humbling, and B, there are lots and lots of stories that contain that same kind of arc. And to me, those stories have that arc and are so powerful because they come from a thing that is true. So when I watch movies that have even like the seed of that kind of similar theme, that's something that kind of really gets my brain working and makes me curious about what is this filmmaker trying to say about the world that we live in general? How does that connect to the way that I know the world through Scripture and teachings in the church? So one that's kind of far out there is, for Pentecost, one of the movies I picked is Fast and Furious 6, which is part of the Fast and Furious series, which is, granted, about as secular as a movie gets. These are movies that contain, like, really big car races and people stealing stuff and, like, scantily clad women in some scenes. It's just, if you're going to recommend something as a religious movie, that's probably not your first choice. But while I was researching my article on Pentecost, one of the things that I found is that holiday, which is one that kind of just gets a passing mention in most churches, I think, or at least that's been my experience, really has an opportunity to explore not just what it means to be the church, but what it means to be the church in a diverse sense, like what it means to recognize and appreciate that kind of found family aspect internationally and within our own communities. And the Fast and Furious series, for whatever else it contains, has always really been well known for respecting the diversity of its characters and giving them a lot of agency. So I wanted to kind of use that as an opportunity to recognize the way that that theme is present in all of the movies, but specifically the sixth film, which plays with those themes in some really interesting ways. And also to kind of encourage people to see that those themes can come from anywhere, right? we see with our eyes, but God sees with the heart, and God sees things that maybe we don't. Which is not to say that I have that, but I feel like we're encouraged to look for themes and to look for spiritual enrichment in places that we might not expect to look.
There's an irony, and it's kind of a frustrating one to me. Very often we get put off by the immorality or the secularism of movies, and people will say, why can't there be good Christian films? But then when some Christian organization does produce a film, there's always the risk that it just doesn't turn out to be a very good movie. Somehow that seems to be a trend. Yeah,
I've seen that too. I feel like the experience of why can't there be good Christian movies, or looking at just the surface level content of a film and labeling it as moral or immoral right off the bat, that was very much my experience growing up, and it was a really confusing one because that was not the experience that I had at home. I had parents who were very interested in kind of the whole gamut of cinema, really, and introduced me to all kinds of stuff. And meanwhile, while I was going to church at a impressionable age in my youth group, I was really confused about what things I was actually allowed to engage with and what things I needed to avoid. And I know that's also been the case for a lot of friends who do the kind of work that I do, and for other friends who have been hurt by the church and left the church. And I want to kind of welcome people back in the sense that, like what a lot of Christian movies do, Christian-produced films, is that they're not great at meeting people where they're at, which makes them kind of poor ministry tools. They're really kind of preaching to the choir because they're producing the kind of stuff that only the people who are complaining really want to see. And so, like, that's not necessarily reflective of my experience or my friend's experience. So if you really want to meet people where they're at and reach out to people who you want to come to church, who you want to see religion as a exciting and intellectually stimulating and welcoming community opportunity, I think you kind of need to be able to engage the kind of art that people see every Friday and every Saturday in the theater.
The book is Films for All Seasons, Experiencing the Church Year at the Movies by Abby Olcese. Where can people find out about it or possibly order it?
The book is available, like you can, if your bookstore doesn't carry it, you can special order it. The website, bookshop.org, is a good resource for buying it online and still supporting local bookstores. So that's kind of the one that I recommend right off the bat. But the InterVarsity Press website, you can also order it there.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being with us. Sounds like a great book. I'm going to have to get a look at it.
Good. Thank you. I'm excited to have you read it.
Be with us next time when we explore other aspects of religious communication and look deeper into the great Christian heritage of free expression. Free Expression with Bill Kassel is a production of Good Shepherd Catholic Radio and Company Publications, where good books, good music, and good radio are always good company. Dan Curris provided technical assistance. Theme and incidental music are by Dan Adam. The program was produced and directed by Bill Kassel. This is Good Shepherd Catholic Radio.